Velocity, how we doing? Nice, very nice. This is the Change Management, a scientific classification talk. If you're looking for another talk, you're in the wrong room. Hopefully this is going to go well. It's going to be fun, at least for me. So I'm Andrew Clay Shafer, and I'm going to give you a little bit of context so we can move through the rest of this story. I like to think of myself as a poor man Sergey Brin, mixed with a poor man Seth Godin, mixed with a little MacGyver, with a little bit of Socrates. So I'm sort of, like a wise, benevolent dictator without a portfolio, looking for something to do. So we'll keep moving. I'll tell you a little bit more about, I used to like to do a lot of math, but no one will pay you to just do pure math unless you go to like really crazy schools. So I started doing more computational modeling, linear solvers, multi-grid type of high-performance computing stuff. That was really fun. Then I went to a startup that built a little Linux server called Realm Systems, which is interesting to this crowd because we learned a lot of stuff about NAND flash storage, and I was very nearly probably the seventh employee of Fusion.io, and apparently chicks really dig like SSDs or whatever. But then instead, because they didn't have funding yet, I went to work for another venture-funded company called Infopia, and we were building an e-commerce SaaS platform, and I learned the hard way a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about today. I'm sure some of you guys have learned these lessons as well. I also got exposed to a lot of ideas about Agile, and if you've ever seen me talk before, then that's kind of a recurring theme. Alistair Coburn, someone I kind of credit with most of my crazy ideas there. I co-founded a company called Reductive Labs. We made something called Puppet. You guys might have heard of it. And I'm also I like to get people together and cause a lot of problems. So we'll walk through that. Currently, I work for a company called Cloudscaling. And we're looking for good people who want to solve interesting problems and build clouds. So talk to me later. So change management. When I ask people that I know that work in this field what they think of change management, I usually get a reaction that looks something like this. And I think part of it is because it's overloaded term, and there's a lot of things we're going to define in a minute, but first we're going to walk through something else. Who's familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect? So the Dunning-Kruger effect is a metacognitive effect which basically says that we can't tell how competent we are sometimes, and particularly if we're incompetent, we can't judge our own competence, and we can't really recognize true competence in others. So we think we're awesome, and then we're really not. But as human beings, we also tend to prefer confidence to expertise. And this is something that many processes in our society, the sales process, for example, is based on this notion of confidence over expertise. And I don't know if you guys deal with this in your organization, but often someone's very confident and they get to make decisions that they probably have no business making. We like to call them, sometimes we call those managers, but you basically have this group of people who are incompetent. They can't judge their own competence, but they're very, very confident. So you have this Venn diagram that results in a lot of interesting decisions, and not just in your organization. It happens in mine too. But we're trying to fix that. We're going to fix that, right? Because we have some stuff, and at the very least, if it does nothing else, tells us nothing else, it's going to make us confident. And that's going to help us do at least some convincing of people who might not want to hear from an expert, but they want to hear a good story. So why does this matter? Why am I giving you all this like Dunning-Kruger kind of rambling, random walk? Because that's how I talk about everything. But really, I don't know, this might happen to someone you know. Probably not yourself, or maybe you saw it in a movie. But you're often in a position where you're like, asked, should we deploy this? And someone will ask, well, how confident are you? And you're like, yeah, let's do this. Boom. Hilarity ensues. It's 6 in the morning. You've been drinking rock stars for the last 3 hours. So I'm reflecting on some of the stuff I saw as a work I did in Puppet and the work I did in organizations. You get to see a lot of infrastructures, and you get to see a lot of patterns. And I don't know how many times working on Puppet projects, You'd hear someone, or they'd call you, and they'd say things like, well, we implemented Puppet, and then we deployed code, and it brought down all our infrastructure. Really? Why? Well, because Puppet did exactly what we told it. Really? Do you deploy your application code without testing it? Interesting. So I like to think about holistic things. So I got this technical background, but then as a founder of a startup, you end up doing a lot of other things, and you have to think about the organization as a whole and how to grow that and make it all work. So I kind of start with the premise that everyone's job is to create value for a business, no matter what your role is, right? If you're not there creating value for the business, then you probably just have a hobby, and pretty soon you're probably going to need another job. Maybe someone will hire you. So what does it mean for us? I'm assuming most of us are ops guys. Who does ops? Who does woo! Who does dev? Who does marketing? They're all at structure, right? So if you don't understand the value that you create at your company, for your organization, then what are you actually doing every day? In the context of your application, can you translate the uptime or the whatever metrics you measure to dollars for that organization, right? There's some value you create. How does that translate into value? So now we're going to get to definitions. Change management. I know I'm very confident in this definition because I got it from Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia is never wrong. Yeah, exactly. So change management, if you just Google it, go to the first thing on Wikipedia, it's not really even talking about system stuff. It's talking about change in a kind of generalized sense with respect to the organization and people. And they talk about different things that I think as technologists sometimes we like to go into the dark, engine room and like tinker on our stuff, but we don't like to really think about how we fit into this stuff. So one of the things I'm trying to urge you through this talk is to not just think about the ins and outs. I mean, there's great technical content in this talk. There's a huge community of practice that will help you, or you probably know more about some things than other people. You can help other people learn how to do the technical stuff, but there's this other concerns that we should be worried about. Now, if you dig a little deeper with respect to technology, and IT in particular, then you start to run into this thing called ITIL, if you read about change management. And most people, when they read about ITIL, or if they've ever had any exposure to ITIL, they have a reaction sort of like this, which goes full circle back to what we were talking about before, because we'll talk about ITIL in a minute. So we're doing web operations. This is not a solved problem, but I think we're making progress. I feel like the fact that Velocity exists, I've been to Velocity for 3 years now, and I've seen this notion of developers and operations working together to deliver value as a reoccurring theme every single time. And it's also a community of practice that has taken these lessons that they've learned, they're sharing them with each other, and I really think that there's this renaissance of both the technical infrastructure and the process. And process is a differentiator that's moving this ball, just pushing the creation of value forward. So how can we add value? Well, as an operations team, there's a lot of things that we end up analyzing, that we think about, that help us deliver value to the organization. So if we're aligned, if our skill set is aligned with these goals that the operations can help with, then I think this is a short list. There's probably lots of other things we can argue about later. But who's ever, I mean, this is ridiculous, right? Like, who's ever seen this quote? Things are going to fail, so what we're trying to do is figure out ways to mitigate failure and deliver the best possible value, to protect our organization from the... Sometimes it's not protected. We'll get to that, actually. We'll get to this. So this is something I think we should think about. I really feel like everything you do in operations sort of goes back to trying to fulfill one of these 6 laws. And this comes from Joe Armstrong. You guys might know him if you're doing anything with Erlang. I think some of this stuff's coming into its own. But it turns out that there's a lot of really, really smart people that worked on computer stuff, and pretty much everything that has to do with anything to do with computer science was done by IBM in like 1960s. So you could go back and look at how people solved some of these problems in the mainframes, in the other things, and sort of bring the science forward. And I mean, we could argue about this later. There's a bar over there, but there's lots of things that you do that I think you could kind of put into these buckets with respect to how you think about deploying, how you think about monitoring, how you think about this big distributed, complex set of architecture that you're maintaining. I think if you break it down, you're pretty much trying to do one of those things. Now, we're going to start talking about the different ways to approach solving this problem. Now, who's ever made changes to the live production infrastructure? Yeah! Right? How many people think that's a great idea? So the pro of that approach, especially when you don't know any better, is it's fast and flexible. Right? There's not this heavy process like version control in the way of what you're trying to do. The problem is we're not really good at that. It doesn't work out all the time. And that leads to other problems that create this virtuous cycle of fire after brightest fire that just it brings joy. That's why you live, right? To be the hero, to put out the fire that you probably created. You left the tinder last week. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the term meat cloud, but that's the term I use to describe the strategy of just throwing more bodies at the problem. And part of it comes from the experience I've had with automation, but you could do that better. There's no way to really scale having people do this work manually on live production systems. It doesn't scale with the people. It doesn't scale with the systems. So then we get to this next level. So people brought down the system. So then the guy that was he's the vice president or director or something, but he never actually did ops, but he thinks it's going to be great if we can make people sign things, because nothing leads to awesome like a lot of signatures. So the idea here is that you have someone who's understanding the business, and I'm not going to say smarter than you, but he thinks that he understands how the business should deliver value, and you need to be supervised. But the problem with this approach is it actually slows things down. I don't know if you've ever been someplace where there's something that you thought was like really important that should be changed, but the process, the pain threshold that it took to get the signatures was a lot higher than like the pain of the thing that you kind of paid your technical debt, to deal with every week or every month or whatever. So you just kind of let it go. And then the other thing is, when people have these things that they're saying, okay, here's the process, sign this. When the production system's down, what does everyone do? Right back to changing stuff in production, right? So they have this master plan, but their plan didn't actually account for anything technical. They weren't taking into account any of the evolution, the renaissance of infrastructure and tools to leverage and create the systems that, I won't say self-healing, but you can do a lot. I mean, if you look at what people are doing with systems right now, and probably systems where you guys work, you can do a lot of stuff, and you don't necessarily need to have a signature to change everything. Now, we're going to go back to ITIL for a second, because that adds another level of complexity and self-righteousness. So the pro, or one of the nice things about ITIL is there actually were some smart people. I don't really believe in standards by committee. They don't ever work, but there's some smart people. They thought about the problem. They had some good ideas. The problem is that none of them really agree, and no one can really know what ITIL says. No one. And the process, sometimes people get really religious about processes, so then they're not really thinking about the application or the infrastructure or delivering value. What they're thinking about is, are we compliant with this stupid process that we made up? of course, until there's a problem. And then what do? We're right back to changing the live infrastructure in production. So then we get a little smarter, and we have tools that can build stuff. So you start to automate with the scripts, the what have you. You guys all know what they are, and there's great talks on this topic in this conference, so I won't dig into the technical thing because we got a lot to go through still. The pro is that computers are really, really good at doing the same thing over and over, much better than we are. The problem is that if you don't think about how you're doing this, then you can actually cause more problems for yourself. If you are cutting down trees with an axe, you can obviously cut down more trees with a chainsaw. You can also cut off more arms and legs. And now there's a fire. But seriously, like, you could really bring down your whole infrastructure. So if you're implementing Puppet, you're implementing Chef, you're implementing anything, your own shell scripts, get some sort of sensible test, dev, and prod environment in front of the changes that you're making. Which brings us to the next layer, the next level of understanding, that your infrastructure is an application. Particularly with some of the things we could do now with virtualization and other abstractions, you can literally drive almost all of your stuff, and we'll talk about this in a second, but you can drive a lot of your infrastructure with APIs. So why not put that thing through the whole test, dev, mumbo jumbo, get it on production after you're very, very sure that it's safe? The problem is we suck at testing. And I think that in a lot of cases, the tests start to become their own technical debt, their own technical burden. So I think there's a lot of progress that can be made. And I believe there's a community of practice that's working on things. I don't know if you're familiar with some of the projects like Cucumber Nagios, or there's a bunch of things, and there's a bunch of approaches. Like I said, I'm going to run out of time if I get too into technical details, but a lot of times you see people learning, they're struggling to test, and they're incurring technical debt in their tests themselves, and so then the tests themselves are becoming painful, and then pretty soon they're like, oh man, we're going to skip it. We'll let QA deal with it. We'll let the users find it, right? So then we get to what I consider sort of the end of this spectrum, and this is an interesting cycle. It's kind of full circle, because when we started with the changing live in production in real time, we could do all this stuff on the servers almost immediately. Now, if you have built up the proper scaffolding and infrastructure for supporting the infrastructure as an application, then you could push things to production without fear. Well, almost. So what you get from production really fast is feedback. You get feedback from your systems and your monitoring, hopefully. You're probably also getting feedback from your users. So there's some cross-cutting concerns. We'll kind of touch on that before this is over. But we still suck at testing. So you're building in these tests. You're continuously deploying. But in general, your real strategy is not to break the same thing twice the same way. And you want to deploy with confidence, right? Because we could tell. And this is another case of people that do testing in production because they don't have any other way to do it. So what are we neglecting? Right? I think when most people talk about infrastructure, they're often talking, not everyone obviously, but they're talking about this sort of application layer, or maybe even the systems layer. But there's a lot of other stuff that has to go on. So if we think about all these problems and how to make choices and how to classify the best strategy for our organization, so one of the things that I'm not going to do ever is tell you should do exactly this. What I would do is try to figure out what are you doing to add value and how can you optimize based on the constraints and the knowledge that you have. So let's think about some of this and our strategy with respect to what we just saw, the spectrum of strategies for deploying and for changing. On one end of the scale, you have things that are less important, and maybe they can go down all the time. And it's not that big a deal. You'll just keep using them. And then you kind of have stuff like your bank account or your mortgage or whatever else that has to do with money. People kind of lose their mind when it comes to money. That gets a little more tentative. Are you going to continuously deploy your application that could potentially change your bank account? Maybe. And then on the opposite, the far end of the scale, you have life-critical systems. Now, I'm going to editorialize a little bit here, but I kind of feel like there's a whole generation of really, really smart people that have been trying to solve Web 2.0 stuff instead of like trying to solve really, really important problems, just because of how the incentives are aligned with the behaviors. I'll editorialize more in the bar later, if you like. We've also kind of brushed over some of this stuff, and I know there's people here that have a lot of expertise in this, probably a lot more than I do, but we kind of assumed that we're talking about changing the application code, and maybe sort of talking about changing the system code. One of the things that I've talked about, if you've ever seen me talk before, is how you can put your whole infrastructure through the test dev prod cycle. You're going to build your images from bare metal to the application, put that through your continuous integration. Everyone's happy. CPUs, you can maybe talk about virtualization and EC2, and okay, we're going to do that. But if you get to a certain scale, then virtualization has a non-trivial overhead, and you might want to actually run real metal CPUs. And then you have your network and your storage, and we could argue about which one's on which end of the scale there. But who's going to continuously deploy their storage array, right? Like, what does that even mean? So we're kind of talking about different things, and you might actually want a signature to do the network, redo all the switches and the network topology. But as much as you can take advantage of it, you want to think about your infrastructure as an application, and that gives you a lot of power and a lot of flexibility. So to whatever level you can push this down the stack, and we saw at Ignite last night, people are working more and more on automating the network. And I think that as we get better abstractions for the network, virtual storage, virtual networking, then it becomes more and more infrastructure as code all the way down that stack. We're going to get there. We're not there today, especially if you have to run your own data center. There's also, when you start thinking about how your process should work, there's a big difference between what is a proactive activity, where you have a planned function or you have a planned upgrade, and then when everything's on fire. And I'm not saying you should result necessarily to doing everything in production, but if everything's down, like sometimes that's actually maybe the best strategy. Don't do it every day. And there are so many more dimensions that we could talk about and think about. The bar's over there. We'll talk later. But I'm just trying to get your juices flowing and kind of provoke thoughts about how you can think about these different things in context of how we manage our infrastructure, how we change our infrastructure. So now moving on, there's technology. We talked about technology. But there's also, in the context of the value chain, there's a lot of other things. There's people. And those people might want to know stuff. They might need to know stuff. People that we can talk to, we could tolerate, they sort of speak the language. Then there's people that they're not of the same tribe, and we might not communicate with them as effectively. But that doesn't mean that they're not part of this chain of value. They're not part of creating value. And I think that we need to, as human beings, as operations superstars, heroes, we can do better. We can be more communicative. And this is a slide that I actually had in my Ignite or my Velocity talk last year. And I was talking at the time about developers and operations. So you have this separation of mentality, the two different tribes. You have the developers and the operations, and they're separated by the wall of confusion. Who has a wall of confusion where they work? You don't have to raise your hands. Oh, you can. And what that tends to do, especially if you're going through some of these really, really heavy processes where you're not actually talking to each other, then people get a little upset. And you can fix a lot of problems by communicating effectively. I think most people at the root, they want to do a good job. If they understand what's happening, if they understand why what they're doing is causing problems for you, and vice versa, like if you know that you're causing problems for someone else, and you want to do that, then you're kind of an asshole. And you should probably stop doing that. You should probably do that less. I'm just going to go out on a limb there. We're working on that, right? We're trying, I don't know if you're aware of this, but if you Google this, you'll see something. I don't know what your impression of it will be, but you can come to LinkedIn on Friday and get a full day of it. But the problem is that, I mean, it is what it is. It's an opportunity, not a problem. That there's walls of confusion all over the place. And in most organizations, this is, who's doing NoSQL stuff or CAP theorem stuff? Kind of, maybe. So in an organization, if you think about the notion of consistency and availability through an organization, when someone makes a decision at an executive level, how does that propagate through, how does that information, how does that data replicate through the rest of that network of the people, right? So if you have a partition in your organization, then it's slowing the flow of ideas. It's slowing the potential value creation that you could deliver to your customer, who's hopefully happy. But if your organization looks like this, he's probably less happy than he could be. So one of the things that I personally, it was sort of beat into my head is this notion of best practices. And when I say it was beat into my head, the first time I said that at the first job I worked, I said best practices, and a grizzled developer said, we don't know what best is. We have no idea what best is. What we can do, the best we can do, is what we think is a good idea today. Whatever the best practices are today, they're going to be our problems tomorrow. Who's dealing with that? Who's using struts? Enterprise Java beans? All right. So this guy, he writes a blog. He does some Agile stuff, does some tech stuff. I stole this from him, but I think it's important with respect to everything else that we kind of touched on through this presentation. And it's this notion of what he calls the flying by the seat of our pants cycle. And that is that everything that's awesome starts with smart people flying by the seat of their pants. That's the top of the cycle. And as you do that, and hopefully you're smart, hopefully you're reflective, you're going to learn some lessons, and you're going to notice patterns, because we as human beings are essentially, we're pattern matching machines. That's how we do it. So you see the patterns, then you're like, yay, patterns, let's make a law. And then you go back to, I should have put the Nosferatu slide in here, but I neglected that aspect of this. But it starts to get very painful, and then people recoil from that process, and they reject it. So what I would encourage you to do, as people who have come to Velocity, who are actively seeking information, who are actively part of the community of practice, who are actively trying to better their infrastructures, is fly by the seat of your pants, use your judgment, take advantage of the community, take advantage of the information and the knowledge that's available in all these open source projects, in all these things that are being basically released to you from people who have built amazing infrastructures. And as soon as you see the successful patterns, use them, but go back to flying. Because the end result is known. You're gonna get to the pain. So never calcify anything that you don't have to. And a lot of you are probably sitting in your seat and you saw some of this stuff and you're thinking, oh, that'll be hard, or there's this political situation, or how can I navigate this? How can I change that? And I think the best advice is that you should strive to make the place where you work the place that you want to work. And if you can't do that, I know some place where you can work. So, I mean, but going back to this notion of the spectrum, you be proactive, right? There's lots of things you could have done better. I don't know anyone that writes perfect code, that builds perfect infrastructures. Whatever you did before, if you don't look back on it and think, wow, that was something I could have done better, then how much have you actually thought about it? And moving forward, the best strategy is to just roll forward. Who rolls back? on their infrastructure. Screw that. Roll forward. So that's the presentation on change management. I'm Andrew. I'd love to take some questions. Why didn't I roll back? Because I rolled forward, dog. Is that good, or you want to? Infrastructure, especially at the system and application level, is essentially disposable. 2010. If you're trying to fix some bitched up install of a bunch of packages and stuff, just blow it away. Rerun your configuration management package of choice, and rock it. Go ahead. Specific ideas? So I actually gave a 90-minute presentation on that last year at another conference. So I have a long list of them. I'd love to talk to you in the bar. But I think the main thing to do is look at these processes. So dev speaks code. The more that you can automate and share infrastructure, just to give another shout out, if you didn't watch it, go back and watch on Blip TV from last year, the VelocityConf presentation from John Allspaw and Paul Hammond. And then if you talk to me later, I'll send you a bunch of links to the stuff. And then DevOps Days on Friday is essentially a whole day that's devoted to this topic. So it's not, I don't think it's a short answer. Anyone else? Go ahead.
So, Andrew, I think you come out of the kind of agile world where there's kind of a lot of test driving of code and kind of, as you're showing in your presentation, a structured kind of march forward to production, as you mentioned. But you just mentioned Allspot stock from last year. If you look at what they do at Flickr, and I know this happens at Twitter, and I think like at Bebo and perhaps Facebook, they actually are using their users as kind of like a test suite in a weird way.
Absolutely. So I don't think they're skipping past what I'm talking about. I think they're at a stage where they're building, they're using their. So the question is about continuous deployment essentially, and I think the question and it goes back to the business, and if you think about the business of the one who's sort of popularized this is Eric Ries from InView. You know, he's writing a book about continuous deployment, and. You know, God bless him, but it's avatars for chat, right? So that the problems that you have if you screw it up, and plus you know you can respond fast, are small, and you know that the implications of doing that are small with respect to the customers. So I think if you look at it from one of the things, I'm going to give another shout out to Israel Gott, and I think he has some interesting ideas about technical debt, and he's mostly, at this point, talking about analyzing code and getting technical debt in the code in the dollar amount, so you could start to have discussions about how that impacts the business. And I think in infrastructure, you have the same notion of technical debt. So when you're deploying this code to production, if the impact of making a mistake is very, very small, then do it all day. Right? That's the best thing for the business. If you have money or life-critical systems that are in jeopardy from that practice, then you probably need to pull back on the reins and not necessarily adopt a heavier process, but be more confident about what you're deploying. Does that seem like a good answers? I think I'm about out of time. Thank you for coming.